Eric Forrester had spent his entire life learning how to endure silence. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that settles in rooms where one's presence is acknowledged only as history. Where respect is assumed rather than offered. Where a lifetime of sacrifice is reduced to ceremonial reverence. For decades, he had accepted it as the cost of building something enduring. He told himself that leadership was not about being heard at every moment. That true power lay in restraint. Yet what had once felt like wisdom had begun to curdle into something far more corrosive. Fatigue crept in quietly, disguising itself as patience, until Eric realized that what he was truly feeling was not exhaustion, but erasure. Forrester Creations had been born from Eric's vision, his stubborn belief that craftsmanship and identity could coexist with ambition. He had built it with his hands and his instincts, long before it became an empire debated in boardrooms and dissected by analysts. Every corner of the company carried his fingerprints, not just in design but in philosophy. Yet as time passed, Eric found himself increasingly sidelined, treated less like the architect of the house and more like a portrait on the wall. Honored, but irrelevant. Ridge and Brooke did not intend cruelty, their offense was subtler, more insidious. They assumed leadership had naturally passed on, that authority was inherited through momentum rather than earned through acknowledgement. In doing so, they stripped Eric of the one thing he had never relinquished voluntarily, agency. What wounded Eric most was not disagreement but dismissal. Decisions were made in his absence. Discussions concluded before his input was sought. His objections smoothed over with reassurances that sounded like gratitude but functioned like containment. Brooke's confidence and Ridge's certainty had formed a closed circuit, one that no longer required Eric's presence to validate itself. Each meeting he attended left him feeling smaller, his legacy reframed as sentiment rather than substance. The irony was bitter. The very company he had built to outlast him was now teaching him how disposable he had become. Eric tried to rationalize it. He reminded himself that generational transition was inevitable, that progress demanded evolution. But respect, he believed, should not be a casualty of growth. The problem was not that Ridge and Brooke led, it was that they no longer listened. Their certainty had hardened into entitlement, and Eric saw in their behavior a dangerous precedent. A company unmoored from its origin would eventually forget its purpose. That realization marked a turning point. For the first time, Eric stopped asking how much more he could tolerate and began asking how much longer he should. The decision did not arrive in a blaze of anger. It came quietly, almost tenderly, during a moment of clarity that surprised him with its calm. Eric understood that confrontation would only feed the narrative of generational conflict, reducing his grievances to emotional resistance. What he wanted was not validation, but finality. He resolved to step away not as a defeated founder, but as a man reclaiming control over his own narrative. The irony was sharp, only by leaving could he remind them of his value. The press conference was arranged discreetly, under the guise of corporate urgency. Eric insisted on privacy in the preparation, knowing that any hint of his intention would invite interference. This was not an act he wished to negotiate. The symbolism mattered. By choosing the company headquarters, he anchored his decision in the very space where his influence had once been unquestioned. The walls had borne witness to triumphs and betrayals alike. They would now bear witness to his departure. As word spread through the Forrester family, unease followed. Emergency meetings rarely signaled good news, and secrecy bred speculation. Some feared financial scandal, others personal revelations. The absence of detail invited anxiety, and the tension gathered like static in the air. Ridge felt an unfamiliar knot of apprehension, a sense that something foundational was shifting beneath his feet. Brooke, ever attuned to undercurrents, sensed that this was not a moment that could be managed with reassurance or charm. Whatever Eric intended to say would alter the balance they had grown accustomed to. When Eric finally stood before them, his demeanor was not accusatory, but resolute. There was no bitterness in his posture, only an unmistakable gravity that commanded attention. The room quieted, not out of deference, but out of instinctive recognition that something irreversible was unfolding. Eric began by dispelling the most anticipated fear, making it clear that this was not about the Logans, not a public airing of private grievances. That clarification disarmed the room momentarily, lowering defenses just enough for the truth to land with devastating impact. Eric announced his complete withdrawal from Forrester Creations. The words settled heavily, reverberating through the silence like a structural failure no one had anticipated. This was not a retirement speech wrapped in sentimentality, nor a strategic repositioning framed as legacy planning. It was a clean severance, delivered without apology or elaboration. Eric spoke of his decision as a conclusion rather than a protest. A necessary end to a chapter that had run its course. He did not ask for understanding, nor did he offer reassurance. The finality of his declaration was its power. Shock rippled through the room. Ridge's disbelief was immediate, rooted not just in surprise but in the sudden recognition of what he stood to lose. Brooke struggled to reconcile the gravity of Eric's words with her assumption that his presence was permanent, immovable. For years they had treated Eric's endurance as a given, mistaking his silence for consent. Now, faced with the consequence of that miscalculation, they were left exposed. The implications were immediate and staggering. Forrester Creations, an institution defined as much by Eric's philosophy as its brand, now faced an existential question. Leadership vacuums invite chaos, and the absence of its founder created a void that no title or succession plan could easily fill. Investors, employees, and rivals alike would interpret Eric's departure as a signal, whether or not one was intended. Stability, once assumed, became negotiable. Eric offered no roadmap, no reassurance of continuity. He simply left. His exit was not dramatic in gesture, but devastating in meaning. By refusing to explain himself further, Eric denied them the comfort of narrative control. He left behind not just a stunned family, but a company forced to confront the fragility of its own hierarchy. What none of them fully grasped in that moment was that Eric's decision did not mark an end, but a beginning. Freed from obligation, he was now positioned to redefine his influence on his own terms. The possibility of alignment with Katie and the Logan brand lingered as an unspoken consequence, one that threatened to reshape industry alliances. Eric had not burned a bridge, he had chosen a different road. As the doors closed behind him, the Forrester dynasty stood at the edge of a reckoning. Power, once centralized and unquestioned, was now contested. Loyalties would be tested, ambitions exposed, and the future of Forrester Creations would be forged not in legacy, but in conflict. And at the center of it all loomed the unanswered question they were only beginning to understand. What happens when the man who built the house finally decides to walk away? Ridge Forrester had always believed that strength was something inherited, something absorbed over years of proximity to power. He had grown up watching his father weather storms that would have dismantled lesser men. And from that observation, he drew a dangerous conclusion: that Eric Forrester was indestructible, that his presence was permanent, that the foundation he provided would never truly disappear. When Eric announced his departure, it was not merely a professional shock for Ridge. It was an existential rupture. The ground beneath him did not tremble gradually. It gave way all at once. In the moments following the press conference, Ridge felt himself suspended in a strange emotional vacuum. The room buzzed with confusion, whispered speculation, and restrained panic, yet he remained curiously detached, as though his mind refused to process what had occurred. He replayed Eric's words repeatedly, searching for nuance, for hidden intent, for the possibility that this was another test, another calculated move designed to provoke response rather than enact finality. But the absence of explanation was its own brutal clarity. Eric had not been posturing. He had been leaving. What unsettled Ridge most was not the loss of authority, but the sudden realization of how much he had taken for granted. He had assumed that leadership was a natural progression, that his role at the helm was validated by momentum rather than consent. Eric's silence over the years had been misread as endorsement, his restraint mistaken for acquiescence. Now, confronted with the consequence of that assumption, Ridge was forced to reckon with a truth he had long avoided. Respect, once eroded, does not announce its departure. It simply withdraws. As the weight of that understanding settled in, Ridge's body began to betray him. At first, it was subtle, an unfamiliar tightness in his chest that he dismissed as stress, the inevitable byproduct of crisis. He attempted to regain composure, to reassert control through motion, through command, through the familiar rituals of leadership. Yet his breath came shallow, his thoughts fragmented. The pressure intensified, radiating outward, transforming anxiety into something far more primal. His heart, long accustomed to operating under strain, now struggled beneath the accumulated burden of unspoken guilt and unresolved conflict. Brooke sensed the shift immediately. Years of proximity had taught her to read Ridge's silences, to recognize when his confidence masked something darker. She watched as his posture stiffened, as his focus narrowed, as the color drained from his face. The man who had always seemed unshakable now appeared alarmingly fragile, his authority undermined not by opposition, but by collapse. The irony was devastating. In the very moment Ridge was forced to confront the consequences of sidelining his father, his own body echoed that rejection, refusing to support the image of strength he had worked so carefully to maintain. The pain escalated rapidly, no longer ignorable, no longer abstract. Ridge's breath faltered, each inhale laborious, as though the air itself had grown resistant. Panic flickered across his features. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet terror of a man realizing he is no longer in control. The room that had once felt like a seat of power now felt claustrophobic, its walls closing in as the reality of his vulnerability took hold. Emergency protocols were triggered almost instinctively. The corporate setting momentarily transformed into a space of medical urgency. As Ridge was rushed from the building, the symbolism of the moment was impossible to ignore. The heir apparent, undone in the wake of the founder's departure, physically incapacitated by the emotional reckoning he had long deferred. Forrester Creations, already reeling from Eric's exit, now faced a second crisis, one that struck at the heart of its leadership with brutal immediacy. In the emergency room, time fractured into disjointed impressions. Ridge drifted between awareness and disorientation, his thoughts spiraling toward memories he had not revisited in years. He saw flashes of his father at work, hands steady, eyes focused, a presence that had once anchored him. He recalled moments of defiance, of impatience, of dismissiveness he had justified as progress. Now, stripped of pretense, those moments returned as accusations. His heart labored not just against physical obstruction, but against the weight of regret. Doctors moved swiftly, their efficiency underscoring the gravity of the situation. The diagnosis confirmed what his body had already declared. Ridge had suffered a heart attack, triggered by acute stress layered upon years of emotional and professional strain. The words carried a clinical neutrality that failed to capture their true significance. This was not merely a health scare. It was a reckoning, a physical manifestation of a life lived in constant conflict, of leadership pursued without introspection. Outside the emergency room, the family gathered in stunned silence. Brooke, confronted with the fragility of the man she loved, was forced to confront her own complicity in the erosion of Eric's authority. She had stood beside Ridge as decisions were made, as Eric's voice was gently but persistently marginalized. Now, faced with the possibility of losing Ridge, she began to understand the cost of imbalance, the danger of equating control with stability. News of Ridge's condition rippled through Forrester Creations with alarming speed. Employees who had barely processed Eric's departure now grappled with the sudden incapacitation of his successor. The company's future, already uncertain, slipped further into ambiguity. Questions multiplied without answers. Who would lead? Who could decide? What did loyalty mean in a structure where its pillars were falling one by one? As Ridge lay unconscious, tethered to machines that measured what ambition never could, the narrative of the Forrester dynasty shifted irrevocably. The illusion of invulnerability was shattered. Power, once assumed to be permanent, revealed itself as precarious, dependent not just on vision, but on humility and respect. Eric's absence loomed larger than ever. His decision reframed not as abandonment, but as a warning unheeded until it was too late. Whether Ridge would survive was no longer the only question. The deeper uncertainty lay in what kind of man would emerge if he did. Would this crisis harden him further, or finally force the reckoning he had avoided for so long? And beyond that, could Forrester Creations withstand the vacuum left by a founder who walked away and a leader brought to his knees? As monitors hummed steadily in the background, one truth became inescapable: the collapse of a legacy is rarely sudden. It unfolds through moments of neglect, through silences mistaken for consent, through power exercised without reflection. And now, with Eric gone and Ridge fighting for his life, the future of Forrester Creations stood exposed, waiting to be claimed by whoever understood that leadership, like the heart itself, cannot endure without balance.